Hello and welcome to Autistic FM. My name is Haje. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host on this journey. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find transcripts and additional information about each episode on autistic.fm. Today, I want to start off this episode with a quick trigger warning. This episode contains discussions of sexual assault, child abuse, and trauma. We don't discuss particularly graphic details, but please take care of yourself and listen accordingly. I fully support and celebrate you skipping this and any other episode that you feel might not serve you. In this episode, I'm joined by Cheyenne, a mother, wife, and abuse survivor. She's in a process of understanding her own neurodivergent identity. Cheyenne's story is complex and deeply personal, marked by early childhood trauma and very complicated family dynamics. Through this conversation, we explore the ways in which she learned to navigate intimacy, love, and trust. First as a hurt child seeking safety, and later as an adult working to break generational cycles of abuse. We dig into the ways autism can shape one's understanding of empathy and connection, and how Cheyenne balances her deep sense of justice and honesty with the world's expectations of who she should be. She shares how her son's potential autism diagnosis spurred her own self-reflection, prompting her to unmask and consider that she too might be neurodivergent. Together, we explore how she reclaimed agency over her body and her boundaries, shifting from a definition of intimacy rooted in manipulation and fear to one grounded in comfort, honesty, and unconditional love. It's a candid and powerful conversation about healing, choosing kindness in a world that hasn't always been kind back, and what it means to build healthier, more authentic relationships for herself, her family, and the broader community. So we don't have a lot of advice to share in this episode. It feels to me a little bit more like an important vignette, a glimpse into somebody's life and how they found their way to unconditional love. With all of that said, let's get to it. Roll tape. Welcome to the podcast. Would you start by telling me your name and your pronouns, please?
Yeah, my name is Cheyenne. I use any pronoun someone's comfortable calling me. However, I prefer she, her, or they, them. So.
Thank you. Where in the world do you live?
Missouri, right?
Missouri.
The Midwest.
When and how did you realize that you might be neurodivergent?
Yeah, so about 7 years ago, I had my son, and my brother, he is 32 years old. He is diagnosed autistic, has been since he was like 4 years old. So I kind of already knew I had a family history of it. And we were kind of expecting, maybe possibly my son could be. And his actual pediatrician, my son's, didn't want to diagnose him with it at first because we were seeing the signs of it, but it was like more the gifted part of it versus, the dysfunctional part of it, if I'm being, blunt. And the crazy thing is we were trying to teach him tools ahead of time as well to just kind of help him, start out with that support versus, not having it and then having a deficit as he gets older because we weren't paying attention and things like that. So
right.
With my son, and I remember very distinctly the first doctor's office appointment that we had with my son, where we were like, we think he might be autistic. There's a lot of things that you don't realize are like traits of autism until you like meet other people who are autistic and they share things with you that they used to do. My son always lined his cars up in a straight row. And like, that's like a typical like out of the book kind of symptom, And then he taught himself to read when he was 1.5. And I was like, wow, okay, so he's really smart. So there's that, which, I've been fortunate enough that most of the people in my life who are autistic, including myself, including my son, they're like, on the higher functioning side. Like there's not really any other like appropriate terms that don't, label it in that way.
Yeah, a lot of people use high support needs or low support needs.
That is a good alternative.
Totally. Well, and honestly, you know what? We are a no judgment podcast. I can see from how you talk about your kid that you love him. A friend of mine has a trans kid, and his mother, so the kid's grandmother, is struggling with pronouns, and at some point said to the kid, my heart knows, but my brain sometimes uses the wrong word.
Yeah.
And that was the end of the conversation. I was like, actually, that's what the kid needs to hear.
It's gonna make me cry. So sweet. We went to that first appointment with my son's doctor, and she's like, yeah, that, lining up the cars can be a trait of autism. And I was like, it's kind of crazy. When I was little, the sound of ripping paper used to make me scream. It was painful to me. And she was like, well, that's interesting. And she's like, do you have a, family history of autism? And I'm like, well, I know that, my brother's autistic. And then after that appointment, I found out my baby brother, who's 10 years younger than me, is diagnosed autistic as well. And so I was like, yeah, we do have a family history. And she's like, okay, well, let's just keep an eye, on his development as it goes. And I don't think he really ever had any big struggles with, like, he's always been kind of a little bit lower support needs for social functioning, which thankfully, and this is like my whole diagnostic journey. I know I told you, when I messaged you about like my history and everything, I still struggle with getting a diagnosis because like my psychiatrist himself, he's wonderful. And he's like, your self-diagnosis is valid. As we go through this process, it's going to remain valid, until we end up like having something that we could say for certain where we're like, yeah, you're definitely not autistic. But he's the one who encouraged me to go and get like an official diagnosis from the specialist. He referred me and everything.
Yeah.
And it was so funny because when he heard how the initial like denial of a diagnosis, because I am more socially capable than most adults with autism would be considered, which is crazy to me because every adult that I know that's late diagnosed is like, so you can't see a social deficit there.
Well, and that's the thing, right? If you weren't good at masking good or being out in the world, you would have been diagnosed. It's like one of those kind of self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yes.
Like everybody's late diagnosed is only late diagnosed because they figured it out so early of like how to kind of mask enough. And some of us, and I'm realizing this for myself, masked with therapists for many years or with people trying to support us or teachers or whatever. It's like, oh, if they think I'm weird, something bad will happen. It's like, no, if they think you're weird, you might get a diagnosis that's helpful, right? So it's a different, I don't know.
Well, and you say like masking with my therapist, I was really struggling a lot with rejection sensitive dysphoria.
So allow me to jump in with a quick aside here. Rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD, is basically a supercharged emotional reaction to the mere hint of rejection or criticism. It's like having your emotional volume turned up to 11, where even small negative feedback can feel earth-shatteringly painful. Instead of just shrugging things off, people with RSD might see a comment as an attack on their self-worth. Dysphoria here means a deep sense of discomfort or dissatisfaction, often tied to a type of deep emotional pain. One reason RSD has been grabbing more attention recently is that it often shows up alongside conditions like ADHD and autism. In fact, for those on the autism spectrum, RSD can play a huge part of how they experience social interactions. While autism itself can make it challenging to pick up on certain social cues, the addition of RSD can mean that any perceived rejection hits like a ton of bricks, leading to intense anxiety, fear, sadness, or some sort of undescribable emotional pain. And this all just kind of stacks up. Because autistic folks often deal with misunderstandings in communication and can feel alienated in social situations, it makes them feel even more vulnerable to feeling rejected, even if nobody really meant to exclude them. This vulnerability can create kind of a cycle. The more they fear rejection, the more they might want to try and avoid it, which in turn can make them appear withdrawn or uninterested. And sometimes that leads to even more miscommunication and feelings of isolation. The good news is that understanding the link between autism and RSD is a step towards better support. Therapies, coping strategies, and supportive communities can help manage these overwhelming feelings. And over time, individuals can learn to reframe their interpretations, better understand their emotional triggers, and develop a sense of resilience that helps them navigate the world with more confidence and comfort. Let's get back to the interview.
Well, and you say like masking with my therapist, I was really struggling a lot with rejection sensitive dysphoria. So like I was struggling with my interpersonal relationships in the sense that like I don't have a lot of friends, like, and that's not to say that like I would hope I'm a likable person. My husband likes me well enough. The friends I do have like me well enough, but I am aware that I am abrasive sometimes. And I think that the way that I felt about being like that, like having this, not necessarily bluntness, but just straightforward, no bullshit, if you would. Like, I don't like to beat around the bush. It drives me insane. Like I'm one of those people that I say what I mean, and I mean what I say.
So from what I'm hearing, your kid got diagnosed, and then you were like, hey, interesting. So did you go through a diagnostic process yourself after
Yeah,
that?
so it took 4 years to do that, but then I started thinking about how I could possibly be autistic, and so I started like self-accepting and unmasking on my own, and just like letting my freak fly. I was
Hmm.
just like, let's let's just see what happens when I accommodate myself and I stop pretending to be okay with all of these things I'm not okay with. It was a difficult transition for a moment because for that 4 years, my husband and I kind of had this regression in our communication in a way where we were like, this is getting hard. We're arguing a little more than we normally would because, I'm being more truthful and straightforward about how I really feel in a situation. And sometimes for him that can be a little jarring. And he's always been really supportive. And he's like, if you need to go and like have your psychiatrist refer you and you want to do all this, just do it. Like I will be here to pick up the slack with parenting if you are having a hard time dealing with, whatever information and whatever process you're going through with the doctor, et cetera. So he's like, yeah, let's get you referred to the specialist. The same specialist that he referred me to, because I live in a rural area in the Midwest, is the specialist that my son was diagnosed by, which I was like, okay, great. So she kind of has a little bit of information already about me and my family. So she kind of knows the weirdness is there, putting it, how other people would put it before they know they're diagnosed. And so this is why we're kind of in a little bit of a limbo right now. But she only saw me for like 45 minutes. She had me explain a picture book, which I thought I did terribly at because I was like, hey, how do you want me to interpret these photos that you're asking me to interpret for you? And she says, oh, just however you want to. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just give you both my implied interpretation of what I'm seeing here and the literal interpretation. So it took me like almost the whole time to read this picture book.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, the expression on these children's faces, shows me this logically. My brain is interpreting it this way. But like, if I think about what that means with the implications, this is what I interpret that as. And so like I did the whole thing that way.
I
And
feel like even your preamble is like, okay, we don't have to read
right,
the book. You're definitely
right.
autistic.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. And my brother, he is like mad about the fact that like all of this happened and it was just like this barely 45-minute snippet. I have the family history. My brother knows me so well, and if she had just asked him, she'd be like, yeah, she's autistic. It's like he could tell her so many things, but like he's mad because, like you said, the preamble is like just obvious that clearly something a little autistic is happening here.
At some point, my mom told me a story where she was like, "These surveys are never precise enough." I was like, "Okay, well, that's all you need to know." Honestly,
Yeah,
that's your diagnosis right there. And
right.
it's funny because I think both of my parents are probably a little neurospicy, but I don't think that they would pursue a diagnosis or really look into that. Anyway, that doesn't matter.
Well,
What I was super curious to kind of corral us towards, because I have an hour of your time.
I think the best place to start is to just kind of give a little bit of background for
Please.
like my experience with just intimacy in general. Whenever I was 8 years old from 12 years old, I was sexually assaulted by a friend of the family and by several of my brother's friends. And so that kind of skewed that for me to begin
Mhm.
with. Like I just had this, I don't even really know how to explain it the best way. And I apologize. I'm going to get a little emotional. My way of showing emotions is just always crying, no matter what the feeling is. That was a struggle for me because, like I said, I have that toxic family background. My mother's problematic. And when it first happened, she did not believe me. So it was difficult for me to wrap my head around that. And I thought at first it was just trauma that made it so that I saw intimacy in a very strict way, which now I'm realizing it's because of my autism, but also probably a little bit from the trauma. But the way that I saw intimacy, well, at first, one of the people who sexually assaulted me groomed me. And that was an interesting experience because I knew something was wrong whenever I was like, 12 years old. And I had this older young man who is old enough to know better. He was 18 at the time. And very complicated, messed up background, but my mom, and I will say this with my whole chest, I believe she's a pedophile because she groomed young men, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, many of my brother's friends, and my brother and I are 2.5 years apart in age. So when he was 17, I was 15, etc. But so So she ended up sleeping with him. And it was really just, I've just always had this like skewed, messed up, like, oh, I don't even really know how to explain it. It's just like, just backwards view of what intimacy really should be, right? I've always like seen it as like a weapon that people have used, a tool, something that has brought more pain than it has been like care or love,
Right.
or, you know, it's never been a good thing until I met my husband.
And so in this case, you're specifically referring to intimacy as sexuality, yes?
Yes, at that point,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I didn't have intimacy in any other scope because I didn't have somebody in my life to give me intimacy in a, you know, just in a just love kind of way. You know, like I didn't
Right.
have a mother that gave me that the intimacy of care and love, like I would give my son. You know, like the hugs and kisses when they're sad, or just the, you know, squeezing them to say I love you. You know, like and I make sure to give my son all of that because like I missed out on that when I was young. You know, and so I've always had this like intimacy is something that can very much be used to hurt people. And it always was in my life. Like it just was always used to hurt me. And especially with my mom, she would love bomb and then she would use that love to harm me and my siblings.
Hello, me again with another aside. Love bombing is a manipulative tactic often seen in unhealthy or abusive relationships, where one person showers the other person with excessive attention and affection and praise, maybe gifts, early on in particular. This sudden intensity can feel incredibly flattering and romantic at first. And the goal of love bombing, whether it's done on purpose or kind of as a weird side effect for whatever they're going through, is to create a sense of emotional dependence. It makes the recipient feel special, understood, and deeply connected, all in a very short amount of time. However, once the target of love bombing is emotionally invested, the dynamic often shifts. The person who is doing the love bombing may start to withdraw the constant attention and become distant or critical or even manipulative. And this sudden change is what makes the recipient feel really confused, desperate, and eager to do whatever it takes to get them back to that intense affection that they experienced at the beginning. Love bombing is frequently associated with controlling personalities like narcissists, or those who wish to gain power over another person's emotions. It's a form of emotional manipulation that can lead individuals into unhealthy and codependent, and sometimes even abusive relationships. So recognizing the signs, such as overly intense declarations of love early on, or pushing for premature commitments, or even isolating the recipients from friends and family, can help people protect themselves a little bit and help establish healthier relationship boundaries. Google love bombing. There's a lot of really interesting stuff out there on the internet. A bunch of research is showing that autistic folks in particular, when they're at the receiving end of love bombing, can have very, very strong reactions. And that actually works really well on them. So if you're autistic, it's definitely worth keeping on your radar. All right, thank you. Let's get back to the interview.
She would love bomb and then she would use that love to harm me and my siblings. I have 4 siblings and I raised my younger 3. And on a level, my older brother would tell you that I kind of raised him too because he has always been, you know, high support needs autistic. And so he's always kind of been like, at least at my level developmentally or just a little below. And he's always, my parents very much weaponized that against him. And well, it's, I have a lot of anger. And he just recently was able to help him out of the situation that he was with my mom, where she was very much, I would just call it disabled abuse. She was taking his disability, spending it on drugs and alcohol. And my whole life story is so complicated. But I'm such a boring person now. Like I just a person that exists. And it's so funny because it's like everyone, and when I tell people that get to know me, like my life history things, and I'm not going to be shamed about all of it because this is things that happen that I can't change, you know, and I'm just working with them to move forward and heal from it. With my mom, there's just always been a motive behind every intimate thing she ever did. Anything, any sense of like love, every minuscule crumb was just a weapon. And so that was a hard thing. My husband and I have had to make the choice to just work on ourselves and work on our relationship and just get where we are. It's not always been good. I will say when we first started dating and when we were first married, we had a toxic relationship because neither of us came from healthy love backgrounds.
Well, and the wild thing is that people expect other people to know how to love and know how to be in a relationship and know how to what have you. Even with the best intentions, even with parents who are well resourced, have the best intentions, they make mistakes.
Yeah.
Take the best intentions and resources away, and what chance do you have, right?
Right.
And so I think it's a really beautiful thing to hear. Like, I think what you're saying is that you and your husband woke up every day, actively chose each other, and were like, we're going to figure this out. I think that's the best you can possibly hope for. I think that's beautiful.
It's nice to find somebody, both romantically and just like as a person in general, that cares enough about you to take that time and effort of their own, their own labor, their own emotions, and really put that into showing you through solidifying that, through doing what they can to strengthen that, to build a foundation. Because it's like, it's one of those things that, like, my husband, he is such a humble man. Like, his father died when he was 7 years old. And he came from also an abusive background. And so he hasn't had, the example of fatherly love, how to be a father. He's an incredible father, and he doesn't think he is. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, there is no father in the world that would not only work 12-hour days, but then be ready to come home and spend the entire night with his child because his child needs him to be there for him. Like, it just doesn't matter. And he doesn't think that he's like a good dad. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, you need to just hear how incredible you are, and you just don't get it. And that's part of why he's in therapy now too. Not only so he can like improve our relationship even more, but just so that he can, help himself heal, which I think is great. I want that for him. And I've always, only ever wanted that for him. I only ever want him to be as happy as he is. He's like, I'm not a whole person without you. And I'm like, that's wonderful to hear. Like, it's so awkward for me to hear though, because it's like, since I had, such a weaponized background with intimacy, I have a really hard time accepting like just any kind of love in general. And I'm getting way better at it, and I'm getting way better at expressing it too, just because I've been practicing, I guess you would say, Yeah. And my husband has been really wonderful with like being that kind of like practice person. I was really young when I just started thinking about how intimacy like really plays into who we are as people and how it's used in our relationships and what it means. And I started with like this completely upside down backwards view of it. And honestly, I'm proud of myself for coming out the way that I have and having these strong relationships and not continuing cycles of abuse because of what I went through.
You mentioned a couple of things that I noticed and just want to reflect back to you. It's like both of you come from backgrounds that were challenging, and you're choosing to break cycles and figure things out together. And you mentioned that from a very early age, your relationship with intimacy may not have been the healthiest, shall we say?
Yeah.
And like, how did you go about changing that, or how did you go about figuring out a way that intimacy could be a haven of safety rather than a tool of abuse or oppression?
So my husband was incredibly instrumental in that. I think part of the reason that our relationship was so rocky to begin with was because I was rediscovering and reframing what intimacy was supposed to be, what it should be. I was like, this is intimacy we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about like my whole, like where I went from having this just awful experience with it to like eventually accepting it as a loving, warm, comforting, safe thing. And so whenever I was a teenager, I was super promiscuous, and I played into that because it got me attention. It got me acceptance. People were like, oh, well, she's sexy. So, and I was a cutie. Like, I was a bombshell, and you should see pictures of my mom. She was a bombshell too when she was younger. If there was anything my mom ever taught me, was to use my assets to my advantage. And unfortunately, because I had such a backwards view of what intimacy meant and how it was to be used, I weaponized it. And it meant that I dated a lot of guys who were really, really bad for me, outright abusive. I used to have a guy that I dated that I have a phobia of knives. And it's so crazy because I see the same thing in my son, which is, I don't know why we have this knife phobia, but like when someone else handles the knife, like we just have to get out of there. Like we cannot be in the same room. And this boyfriend that I had was aware of my knife phobia and carried a pocket knife around and would take it out and pretend to stab me with it. I just didn't even pay attention to it until after I broke up with him and like started dating my husband. I was like, oh my God, like that was so fucked up. Like that he did that to me. Like, and that I was okay with it. Like, it was insane. I got my boobs whenever I was 13. I was a little bit of a late bloomer. But when I did, they were immediately C cups. It's one of those things where it's like been detrimental because I've had adult men looking at me sexually since I started hitting puberty, you know, and even before then, because I was being sexually assaulted at a younger age, you know. And so, like, I remember one specific incident whenever I was younger, where we lived in this like apartment complex kind of thing that had this courtyard in the middle area where like the houses all faced inward. But we had this older Black gentleman. He's probably in his like 50s, maybe 60s. And he would sit outside of his house every morning. And I remember my mom used to have me go over there to talk to him. And this is probably something that she was doing nefariously because she's always been a drug user and always, you know, I think that she was probably using me to basically be a proxy for her for a transaction with him, right? But she'd always send me over with like money, or she'd send me over with a casserole or something as like payment, like a favor for him, like, oh, go give this to. But he used to always make comments about me and my body at like 12 and 13 years old, and like my mom was proud of it. You know, she was like, oh yeah, like that's my daughter, like she's so sexy. And now I'm just like, oh my God, like very much abusive, very much wrong. Like, no.
That's so dark.
Yeah. So it's bad. But, and that's one of the reasons why I'm like, I think my mom's a pedophile, because not only did she do things like that, but she also very much groomed young men that were my brother's friends. And so, yeah, it's just like these incidents happen. And then after all of them happened and I met my husband, like I met him at 9 years old. We'd always been friends. And it was so crazy because like he always told me from the day that he met me that he loved me every day, regardless of, you know, what we were going through. If he and I met, he would always give me a hug. And we've always just been best friends. And like I always wanted those hugs because he's 6'4" and he's very tall. But it was so cute because I think that was where I started seeing intimacy as a good thing. Looking forward to that day when I would cross his path walking to our buses after school, and I would be able to come to him and get this hug that was just so comforting. And so it felt safe. This is a nice experience. And like, I have always been like, I don't like unwelcome touch, and he's always understood that. And I think part of the thing about like those hugs and everything is like, he never expected me to give him one. We would be kids and we would have this like montage, you know, of us meeting each other on the sidewalk on the way to our buses. And like, he would stop and he'd look at me awkwardly, and then I would like put my arms out and he'd give me a hug. And like, it's just this memory that I just have that's one of my favorites, because it's kind of the start of our relationship romantically in a way. Because not only did he just make me feel so safe, but he loved me, you know, without expectations, which was wild. It was something that I didn't ever really have. So like at that point, we had been doing this whole like hug thing for years at this point, and I had gone through this relationship with this kid that I had a crush on for forever. And at the time, my husband and I were like probably closer than we've ever been as far as like friendship was concerned. And I just remember within a span of like 2 days, this kid just broke my heart. Like he led me on, and then he was like, no, you're ugly, you're gross, like I don't like you. Like it was very much mean spirited. And the one thing that really solidified the fact that I wanted my husband to be the man that I was with for the rest of my life was that night he was just literally on call essentially to be there to pick up the pieces. And like, he did not care, you know, what his feelings were in that moment. Like he was just there for me. And so the next day I was like, hey, do you want to be my boyfriend? And he was like, are you sure? And like, it wasn't a sense that he was like, are you sure? As in like, I don't trust you. But my mom has always sabotaged most of the relationships that I've had. And I think she knew that if I were to get in a relationship with my best friend since 9 years old, who loves me, because she could see it, I'm sure she could, that I would just not be controllable anymore, which is exactly what happened.
So you mentioned that you had, I think you described it as promiscuous in teenage years. Was that a way for you to kind of reestablish agency over your own body and your own desires?
Yeah, so like I think it was partially that, but also partially just kind of like a method for me to express my anger and frustration and sadness and like all the feelings that I was feeling that I couldn't express. Because like I said, everything just is just crying for me. Like it's hard for me to just express real feeling, and I don't know if you can tell, but like I'm over animated on my face now just because like I've just decided, no, I'm not going to hold it. I'm going to let all of that resting bitch face and that, like, I'm disgusted, because I have no reason to. The people in my life love and care about me. They know what my intentions are because they know how I am. So, like, I don't care if I look bitchy whenever I'm talking about something. And so, like, back then, though, I was, like, always just, like, this perfect little calm, kind, just stoic teenage girl that always did what she was told. And so acting out through, I'm not even going to say sexual means, but just physical touch, physical interaction, was how I expressed that. And I was like just a lot of like making out with guys. Like I probably had a different like boyfriend or somebody that I was like seeing or talking to like at least once a month. And and I'm obviously not proud of that. Like it was bad decisions left and right. And I was very much not only seeking the comfort and like trying to find that in these other people, but also just expressing these feelings that I had that I didn't have another way to express aside from like I could have gone down the route of being, physically harmful to other people. Instead, I just chose like my sexuality to express that through, because I self-harmed, I was a very chronically depressed teenager. I smoked a lot of weed and drank a lot of alcohol whenever I was a teenager too. I always had like this thing in the back of my head that like I didn't want to cross certain lines. So part of acting out the way that I did made it so that I was able to control where that line was. And that was helpful to me in like experiencing good intimacy in a way, because I've always struggled with boundaries. I've always struggled with practicing that autonomy over my own self.
And so at some point, it sounds like you were able to get yourself to a place with healthy boundaries and
Yeah.
more clear what you want and what you don't want. What shifted? How did that shift?
Honestly, I don't really know the exact point when it shifted, but I know that coming out of the abusive environment that I did whenever I was a child, and seeing that I still had my 3 younger siblings that were going to be left there, when I graduated high school and moved on to better things, because I had full rides to Missouri State University. I was fully prepared to go, but I had that like guilt and shame, and then I just something like snapped in me where I was like, I don't want this feeling anymore. I don't want this. This isn't what I want. Like I don't want to be confused about people's intentions with me. I don't want to be in pain all the time whenever I'm having a relationship with somebody. Like I want to be loved. I want what I believe love is. And I grew up watching a lot of like Full House and Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and seeing the parental child relationships there. This is gonna make me cry because but that was part of like what kind of like almost made me think, this is not okay. What I'm experiencing in home is not okay compared to media's portrayal of what parents should be, Because like, and one specific scene from Full House, I think it's DJ. Her dad gets in an argument with her, and then she's really upset, and he tells her to go to her room, and she's up there crying, and he comes back and he checks on her and apologizes, and that was like the breaking point for me to see.
Okay, so I was so moved by Cheyenne and her reaction to this particular episode that I went way too deep into a rabbit hole, perhaps especially given that I've never actually seen a single Full House episode. But I was really intrigued. And so, after a bunch of research, the episode Cheyenne is talking about here is episode 21 from season 3 of Full House. The episode is called Just Say No Way, and it's about teenage drinking. The scene in question is incredibly sweet, and here's a little excerpt.
You believe me, don't you, Dad?
I'd like to, but you do smell like beer.
Someone spilled it on me, really?
DJ, go to your room. I'm going to talk to Jesse, and then I'll come up and talk to you.
I owe you a big apology.
You really hurt my feelings.
I'm sorry for not believing you, pal.
I guess it did look kind of bad.
It made me crazy thinking of my little niece out there starting to drink. I mean, this isn't fun and games. You know, I've seen it happen to my friends. They think they have it under control. Before they know it, they've messed up their whole lives. That's why I'm so proud of you for making the right decision tonight. The sad truth is that you're going to be faced with a lot of tough decisions in your life. And not just about drinking either, about drugs and about sex and who knows what. I just wish you could grow up in a world where you can enjoy being a kid, but I'm sorry, pal, it's not the way it is. So, I hope that you'll use the same good judgment that you used tonight. Because I never want to see you get hurt. I love you so much.
Love you too, Uncle Jesse. Thank you.
All right. Let's go home, huh?
Isn't that beautiful? And I can totally imagine that if you've never experienced somebody apologizing or somebody actually explaining why they care about you, that this would have been a hell of a scene to see. Anyway, so that's how your dear podcast host fell into a 6-hour Full House rabbit hole and got the Baby Beluga song stuck in my head for an afternoon. Totally worth it. Let's get back to the interview.
He checks on her and apologizes. And that was like the breaking point for me to see the way I'm being loved is not okay, you know? And so I had decided I didn't want myself or anyone else to feel that way, you know? And I think that's part of what it was. Like it was an over time kind of thing where I just kind of kept making these small decisions, being like, sorry, give me a moment. But I was making these small decisions to be like, I'm not okay with this. I'm not okay with being treated that way. And it took me finding the agency with the way that my mom treated me with physical abuse. Like I started fighting back around like 15. And it took that along with having my husband who's there supporting me. Cause like it was around the age of 15 that he just really was gung-ho for me. And that's when our relationship really kind of started seriously, you know, like outside of just being friends. And he saved my life, I think, because he was one of the only people that really showed me healthy intimacy. And I realized I wanted that, you know, I wanted that in every area of my life, you know, sorry.
Yeah.
And so he's a very instrumental in making me who I am today because he showed me true, just unconditional love, you know? And that's not something that a lot of people have a privilege of having. Like, that's why I say I'm lucky, because he really unconditionally loves me.
Yeah. Well, and the thing about TV, right? They always say TV isn't real, which is true, right? It's all scripted, it's all acted. But at the same time, you can watch something and go, hey, maybe that isn't real, but what I have isn't real either. There has to be an in-between. There has to be a better than this, right?
Right.
You mentioned that most people don't have unconditional love, and I honestly don't think that is true. I think most people do. But the thing is, when you grow up in a world where that feels so alien,
right?
Like when you see it, it becomes this thing of like, oh God, what happens if I lose this, right? But the truth, of course, is if it's unconditional,
you won't.
You don't lose it.
Yeah.
And it's this really weird mental jujitsu that I've sat with quite a few people who are trying to figure that out. And it's really beautiful to see you find, like, you have this incredibly rooted and like, you know what's what energy about you, which is, that's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah. I think it's something that I've really had to just accept love, you know, accept love as it's supposed to be versus, you know, like I know a lot of my husband and I's relationship to begin with was so like just tumultuous because I couldn't figure out how to accept the fact that there's someone here who loves me regardless. Like it just didn't matter like what I did or what I said or how I acted. He loved me and still loves me to this day, and it does things to make our relationship and our love stronger. And it's just like, that was so foreign to me, just so completely foreign. But once I got some of it, like, I realized I wanted that, and I wanted other people to experience it too. So like, I'm the person that will tell a stranger on the internet that they are loved and fully mean it. Like, because I love people. I think everyone deserves love as it should be, unconditional and without strings, without manipulation, and so I fell headfirst into just really pushing that forward. And that's one thing my husband's always been like, you are one of those people, and he uses this metaphor with basketball, and I never understood what it meant, but he's like, you go hard in the paint. And so he's like, you go hard, meaning like when people are in a tense situation in a basketball game and they're really just trying to get the ball in the basket, they're trying as hard as they possibly can, and it shows. Like, it's obvious. And he's like, that's why I never want to be on a side opposite you, because he's like, you are so passionate and supportive, and you do everything you possibly can. You pull out all of the stops. And like, at first I was like, that's such a weird way to describe it. But he's like, that's the best way that I can, because I like basketball. And that, to me, I see you just trying as hard as you possibly can, and pulling out every single trick to just, and they're not like manipulative, like tricks, like that, like, not like that. He means just like doing every good possible thing you could possibly do. I've always like prided myself on that. I've always been, like, that's one of the things that I really think is a superpower, if you will, of my autism, is that strong sense of justice, that passion towards, really going all in if I think something is right. And so that's another form of like the intimacy that my husband's like, he's like, I don't quite understand it because I'm not you, but he's like, I understand it because I receive it from you. In the sense that, like, I like the way that I feel when you are being you and being your full passionate self for me.
This is the thing with type A personalities. This is the thing with people who have big personalities, and the people who've run out of fucks to give. You're like, no, I'm just going to, just going to be fully there and do me, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, Jan, it's just been such a beautiful conversation. I'm so grateful to you for talking with me. I'd love to wrap this up with a couple of standard questions for you.
Sure.
And then I will let you weave back into your day.
Yeah. Okay.
The first one I'd love to ask you is, what do you wish people would understand about autism?
I think one of the biggest things that I noticed, not just about myself, but my son, is that people think a lot of the uncomfortable behaviors that we have are a choice, that we choose to be obtuse or choose to be defiant or choose to be dramatic, but we're not. Like, we try our very best. We're fully aware of how we're affecting other people. And I just wish people would be a lot more understanding that we're working so hard to fit in and to make other people comfortable. And neurotypical people don't tend to have to do that. And I think if more neurotypical people could accept that and be a little more understanding and accommodating for that, might make their lives a little easier. You know what I mean? We're just full of so much love, and the whole no empathy thing, like, that drives me up the wall because my experience, every autistic person I've ever met has too much empathy. So much so that it hurts themselves. And my son, oh my gosh, he is the most compassionate, empathetic person on the planet. And my heart breaks for him because I know how he's feeling. And it's not great. Like, it's just like, neurotypicals don't experience this level of just love for people that would mean nothing to them if it weren't for the moment they're interacting with them. And I think that's important for a lot of neurotypical people to understand, is that we don't approach them with the predisposition that they could possibly be doing something to hurt us like they do. They make assumptions that we're working nefariously, but we're fully there, like, just to be there, to be available.
I have a theory. I suspect a lot of neurotypical people mistake empathy, which is the feeling of being able to feel what you're feeling, with, hey, why don't you just understand me? Like, that is a different thing. Like, if you are not saying something literally that I can understand, then, like, I don't understand, but that doesn't mean I don't have empathy, right? It's interesting, and I'm curious if we actually get bitten twice. One, empathy, the ability to feel what somebody else is feeling. Like, I understand literally what that would be like.
Yeah.
And I experience that all the time. But if somebody else has a slightly different definition, it's like, hey, you should understand what I understand. It's like, well, that's different.
Right.
It's very different.
A lot of us autistics focus on logic, actual factual information, literal definitions of words. And so our view of the world is, if our understanding is based on what we have in front of us, the information that we're given. And a lot of neurotypicals, they fill in a lot of blanks. They make a lot of assumptions. And then they expect other people to do the same thing. And we can't, a lot of the times that we really just cannot. So.
And I imagine if you don't have a deep understanding of what empathy is and means, or maybe we just disagree, like maybe we just misunderstand each other fundamentally, where from their perspective, we don't have empathy, and that's fine. From my perspective, I do have empathy, but I have a very clear understanding of what that means. And if we disagree on what it means, you end up in this really weird, like, hey, we're using the same words, but I don't think we mean what you think it means, kind of thing.
Yeah, I find that to be the case like 99% of the time. It's just, it's one of those things that I think it takes work on both sides, and a lot of times you just don't receive that effort from neurotypical people.
Well, and I think actually autistic folks have an edge there by virtue of, like, not because we're necessarily better at empathy, but
of course,
if we don't somehow figure out what the other person is thinking or feeling, we can't exist in the world.
Right. Exactly.
And that's, if you've never experienced that, if you're always on the same wavelength as other people, if you're always like, just kind of like cruise along and you kind of get each other, oh, what a wonderful gift that would be. I don't know what that's like.
I mean, I think that's part of like the reason why autistic people flock together too, because like we kind of are on the same wavelength with each other. Like everyone in my life is autistic, and we get along really well, and we're really close with each other. And that's because we kind of, we have that neurotypicals typically have, but in our own spicy, weird way. You know what I mean? And I think it sucks so bad, because like the only thing that I would ever want is that everyone can coexist in the way that we all understand each other.
You just mentioned that everybody around you is autistic or neurospicy. And I think that segues really beautifully into my final question, which is, can you tell me a story of a time where you were seen and loved in exactly the right way for you?
Yeah, man. A lot of them, actually. I think one of the most recent ones is one of my really good friends. I'm going to call her Jay. She texted me and she goes, "Hey, I have something for you." And I was like, "What?" And she's like, "Yeah, next time I see you." And it just happened. She came over to my house to give this to me. And she's like, "Yeah, I have these things for you." And I'm outside and she comes up out of her car and she pulls them out of her pocket. And she's like, "I brought you rocks." I was like, "Oh my gosh." And she's like, "Yeah, I was out in Thousand Hills and I forgot to message you and tell you I was out here. I would have invited you, but my brain was like, yeah, I'm just enjoying the moment. But I found these rocks and I was like, oh my gosh, Cheyenne would really like these." I was like, "Oh," like she brought me trinkets and they were just 3 little tiny pieces. One was rose quartz, one was just clear, like cloudy quartz. And then the other one was a piece of agate. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, these are so cute. This is perfect. Like, thank you." Like that was.
But it's such a beautiful example of like, cost nothing means a lot.
Yes.
Like
exactly.
that wasn't her giving you 3 bits of rock. That was her going, "Hey, I miss my friend. I wish she was here. And this reminds me of her. And I'm going to give this to her." Can I tell you a story of the biggest meltdown I ever had? That was actually related to a gift.
Sure.
So I spend a lot of time working with the Human Awareness Institute, which is like a 50-year-old organization that does a lot of love, intimacy, and sexuality workshops. And one of the facilitators was retiring. It's a guy named Peter. And he'd been a facilitator for God knows how long, 30 years maybe, right? He's led a lot of my workshops. And it was his like retirement party at the end of a workshop. And this group of people had banded together to get him a gift. And before the gift, they did a roast. And I was like, oh God, this is triggering my bullying shit so badly. Right? They're just saying shit. And he was loving it. He was just eating it up. I was like, okay, well, he's having a very different experience than I am. But I'm triggered to my eyeballs. I think I'm going to leave because they're bullying him. And clearly that was about me, not about him.
Right.
I was like, this doesn't feel like this doesn't happen in this organization. But clearly they know him. And then they were like, oh, and we banded together and got you this beautiful gift. And I was like, oh, they never asked me to contribute to this gift. I feel terrible, right?
Yeah.
And so they gave him this massive, extravagant box, like a beautiful box, and handed it to him. And they said, this is what you've always wanted. And I was like, oh, God. What if they got him the wrong thing? What if it isn't the perfect thing after 30 years of service, right? I was already triggered from the bullying. And then I was super like, oh God, what if the gift is wrong? And he opens it and the box was empty. The gift was, the joke was, of course, he's Zen Buddhist, right? And he's like, everything he's always wanted is nothing.
Yeah.
Right? Ha ha ha, funny joke.
Right.
But I cried so hard because I was like, nobody knows me well enough to give me my equivalent of an empty box, and that the entire room knows exactly why that was the perfect gift. And even telling this now, I'm like, oh God. Like, and I went home and I cried and I cried and I cried. And eventually I called a friend to come over. I was like, could you please just come and hold me? Because I am losing it. Mm-hmm. And she came over and she helped me while I was crying my ass out for another couple of hours. It's like one of the biggest meltdowns I've ever had in my life over an empty box, right?
Yeah.
But of course, it's not about the empty box. It's about being seen, being understood, being really deeply understood by a group of people. And I mean, he had tears coming down his eyes because he loved it. It was like the perfect gift. He was like, oh my God, this is so good. And I was like, oh, my life is very different from this man's life. And I love him dearly, but this is a very different universe.
Yeah.
So yeah, hearing you tell the story of your rocks and how that was a meaningful gift to you is like a reminder that, like, hey, when you really know and see someone, those kinds of things, an empty box can be a perfect present.
Right.
3 little pebbles can be a perfect present.
Yeah.
And what a beautiful way to live and to be seen and to be known by the people around you, that they can get you the person present that costs $0.
Right.
Like, it can cost money, right? But it's that piece of it is, to me, is like, oh, it's not about the money. It's not even about the gesture, really. It's about knowing and seeing the other person.
Right. Yeah. I feel that sentiment a whole lot because, like, before I was in this situation in my life where I'm surrounded by people who see me, you know, my life was just filled with special occasions that were just, for lack of a better word, disappointing, because it wasn't even expectations. It was just, it felt like nobody saw me. Like I didn't exist because nobody saw me well enough to know what it was that I would have wanted. And don't get me wrong, I got some like lavish gifts when I was younger, you know. I mean, my father's always been really well off, and he's always, you know, never, you know, skipped out on the cost. You know, if he had known me, really, really known me, he would have known that it wasn't the gadget necessarily that I wanted. It was, you know, what it did for me. It was, you know,
I don't want the iPod. I want the iPod full of curated songs that you know I will love.
Exactly.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. That kind of thing. His gifts were great monetarily. They were definitely expensive, but it was like he would just hand me this piece of emotionless thing. Like it just had no thought, feeling, understanding, and love behind it. It was almost like it was a bribe in a way, you know, to just be like, I gift you really well, you know, so you've got to love me, you know. And
well, and that's the thing about love languages, right? It's like it needs to be a language.
Yeah.
Like you can't just lob a grenade somebody's way and say, happy birthday.
Yeah, exactly. Like,
like,
and that's the thing, like with my husband and I, how he's going to therapy to really learn how to communicate with me in that way. Like, we've always been really good about verbally communicating with each other. He's like, I really want to understand exactly how your brain is working, and I want to see things from your point of view. And that, his sentiment of that is like one of the biggest gifts that he could give me in my love language, is just that acknowledgement and that showing me the effort. A lot of people just don't get it.
Beautiful.
I think also us having the empathy that we have as autistic people gives us that edge, you know, gives us the ability to understand that and have that as like a common goal, as a common understanding, you know. But
thank you so much. This has been a beautiful, intimate, intensely beautiful conversation.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I really appreciated just having the opportunity to share, you know.
Yeah.
I think we don't get anywhere without talking about things, you know.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. You can find us on TikTok on Autistic FM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, and on the web on autistic.fm. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Haje Kamps. If you know anybody who would be a great guest on the podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email us on hello@autistic.fm or reach out via the socials. See you next week.